Welcome back to a follow-up to ICNC webinars. We had so many questions from our recent webinar, Dollars and Dissent, with Benjamin Naimark-Rowse, that we have opted to continue the conversation just a little bit further. So Ben, I want to thank you for joining us again to take a few more questions. These are questions that were submitted while we were having our recent discussion. This is all around Ben's new special report from ICNC Press called Dollars and Dissent, which looks at how donors can have and might engage with supporting nonviolent movements and organizing. So the first few questions we have to do with the constraints. And the first one we're starting with because it is a very common question. And that is, how can donors navigate the government arguments that protest movements are being funded by foreign forces? Doesn't funding just support narratives from the state that protesters are just the agents of foreign meddling?
So thanks, Bruce. Thanks for having me back, and I'm happy to see all the interest in this theme of dollars and dissent. And I think the first thing I'd say about these sort of accusations, perceived or real, that outside support for organizing and movements is somehow sort of a puppet outside controlling is that in closing spaces or authoritarian regimes, that accusation is often leveled regardless of whether a movement or activists receive any outside funding. So it's always there and it's often used. The second is that movements win primarily because of what they do within their countries, not because of the support they get from outside. So any donor that's governmental or not, that's thinking about supporting activism needs to keep that in mind, that any support should be framed as fostering the legitimacy, the agency, the resiliency of people in their own country to have say in their society and to resolve their own problems, their own challenges, their own lack of democracy or healthcare or education and such. So that's a narrative that outsiders can use. The last thing I'd say about this is that direct sort of cash support to organizers and activists is often unhelpful. It's far from the first thing or the first things that any outside donor could do productively. So providing educational materials or trainings, technical assistance, support for independent media, support for sort of strategic planning. These are things that are maybe a little less sort of value laden, and also a little easier to provide without telling activists or organizers what to ask for. Or what demands to make. It's more about building their agency and their own skill set.
Wonderful, thank you. So here's an argument, and let us know what you think of this. So given what you've described about the limitations of direct support to movements and the cases of organizations successfully investing in systems approaches, would you say maybe the best way for donors to support movements is by funding things that might fall into your initial categories of coalition building or capacity building, as opposed to direct support for grassroots movements?
Definitely. So training that ICNC and many other groups sort of provide has been found by research to be particularly helpful in sort of the pre-movement phase, ensuring that movements have the ability to build leadership and to train and carry out nonviolent discipline and to get their messages out through independent media and this sort of thing. So this is around capacity building, but it's also in the early stages before movements end up on the news. One of the respondents in my study, one of the interviewees said, movements strategize in silence. So it's often in these early phases when there may not be as much sort of repression or outside focus on a movement, when some of the sort of capacity building and such can be useful. Now, research has also found that it's not just giving training or technical assistance to movements that can be useful. One of the more important elements of those trainings is bringing activists together within a country, across a region, internationally, so that they can build trust and relationships with each other. They can learn from each other, do one-on-ones, so that when there's a crisis or when a later phase of a movement happens where there's peak activity and there's a lot going on and they're trying to make split-second decisions about tactics and staying safe, that there's peer support. Movements leaders know who to get in touch with. They have existing relationships. They know where to go to be safe. Maybe it's within the country. Maybe it's going to a different part of their own country. So that sort of network building and creating space for activists to learn from each other and build power together across borders is particularly helpful.
Thank you. One attendee noted that they were fascinated by the reasons funders say they do not or cannot support nonviolent movements. They write, "My experience has been a little different. Typically, funders are dismissive or unaware of the idea of nonviolence or of the movement leaders themselves, which are often youth. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and reflections on this point."
Sure. So it's a really important point. Often donors, whether they're governmental or private foundations, public charities, if they don't have permanent staff in a country, they'll do a 1 week or 2 week sort of scoping mission or sort of hold a series of meetings. Often they don't leave the capital. Often they reach out to existing NGOs and international NGOs to say, who should we talk to? That's all well and good, but often movement leaders come from historically excluded sort of sectors of society. Often they're young people, students, youth. And in many countries, they're farmers and rural people, organizing over conflicts over land and water and such. And so it's sort of the more marginalized or historically excluded communities are, the harder it is often for donors to find them. And often those communities, if they're found and identified, they may not speak English or French or Spanish. They may not speak sort of the language of professional development and fundraising. And so there's a real impetus on outsiders who want to support local people in a given context to build power through organizing and movements, to sort of not go into a society with a preconceived notion of what an organizer looks like or what sort of institutional form they might take, but to go in and explore new partners and be open to going places in a country they may not be used to outside the capital, and really listening and having sort of practicing courageous learning. So maybe we don't know this community, but we're going to listen to them because they seem to be building power and organizing in a good way. So really respecting the local traditions and customs and language and ways of communicating is really something that donors often struggle with, but should try to do more.
It can be improved on. There's growth opportunities, right? All right, thank you. So we have some questions having to do with the strategies or the models of executing funds. So someone writes, "I'm wondering if you look at strategies that conservative funders use to engage with or establish right-wing movements, as in the past 2 decades, they have arguably had more success translating that funding into formal political power and wins. So how might progressive funders you study do things differently? And how do such differences matter?"
This is a great question. It's one that comes up often. I think there's 2 important responses to this. One related to how progressive movements can learn, and another around why they shouldn't learn from conservatives. And I'll start with the latter. right? So often the sort of norms or ideology that goes with right-wing politics is quite hierarchical. It's often zero sum, especially when there's an election coming. We are all going to vote for this candidate because we want them to win, and so the sort of diversity of opinion or inclusion of alternate voices often gets pushed out or harshly excluded. And on the progressive side, um, one of the things that makes progressive organizing messy is that it often is focused on inclusion and diversity and incorporating different views and not shutting people down because they're have a slightly different opinion. And so that messiness is maybe something that makes it harder in zero-sum moments like elections for progressives to wield their power. On the other hand, the messiness is what gives one of the things that gives progressive movements their credibility and their legitimacy, that they are inclusive and that they're not often as hierarchical and exclusionary. So that's one distinction where I think progressive organizers and movements maybe should push back against and not say we have to become hierarchical and exclusionary and such. It's not to say in zero-sum movements you shouldn't try to win, but I think it's an area where progressives shouldn't just copy right-wing movements. The second response, which is an area where we progressives have something to learn from authoritarian or right-wing movements, is around the way they build leadership and community and power. So the NRA, for example, many people join the NRA not because they're staunchly committed to the Second Amendment. Many people join because they want to go to a shooting club, because they join a friend who's going to some sort of activity gathering. And while they're doing these social activities, they learn political messages and they become involved in activism. And so what this means is that when there's a political loss, when the NRA fails at some legislation or what have you, people don't pack up and go home. The next weekend, they show up at the shooting club because they're with their friends and there's a social activity. And so that type of sort of social activity and relationship building, the Sierra Club, by the way, has done this well too. There's good research on this. It's not just right-wing groups. It's the relationship building and the social networks and the social activities that bring some staying power and some strength of the movement beyond just the political aim.
Great, thank you. Another question, could you speak to the issue of scale? Supporting grassroots work is not very expensive. I hear people talking about the lack of capacity to monitor or difficulty to evaluate spent money. And related, what are the biggest amounts invested in movements and how?
This question of scale is a great one. Oftentimes we sort of use of a business frame for thinking about scale. More money is going to scale, right? Funding more movements is going to scale. But in reality, in a movement framework, going to scale actually may mean bringing in more participants. It may mean creating new coalitions. So scale in that context is, in a movement context, is less so about money. It's more so about attracting people with good messaging and providing reasons for them to stay and be involved. See that previous question about building community and such. And often we see that movements are quite good at autonomous resourcing, at self-resourcing. People offering their house for movement leaders to come and talk and to convene. There's sort of sweat equity in a movement. And there's something about people saying, you know what, I don't have a lot of money, but I can pay my bus fare to go to this meeting. and then the meeting is housed in someone's home or business office, where that's also sort of in-kind donation. And so what that does is there's not a whole lot of money that's required to do this type of organizing. And it gives people a sense that they're committed because they've little money they put in for bus fare, they've offered their home. There's a real sort of strength of community and ties that's developed there that might not develop if there's money that just comes in from outside and says we'll get you a taxi to come to the meeting. And then question of amounts of money that are invested. I mean, this is there's compared to the money that's given to other forms of social change, other strategies that are more institutional, advocacy, litigation, and such. The amount of money that goes to movements is quite small. It's only 3% of all of human rights dollars, basically over the last decade, that goes to this grassroots extra institutional strategy of change. There are a number of examples I'm more familiar with them in the US, where the Open Society Foundations or McKinsey Scott have given sort of tens or hundreds of $1 million commitment to certain types of organizations. This support tends to go more so to sort of civil society groups that are maybe leading a movement or part of a movement, but it's on the whole, those are exceptions rather than the rule.
Right. Very interesting. I think of another recent study which we just published looking at, well, it's called Resource Mobilization in Palestinian Nonviolent Campaigns, and it describes this dynamic you're discussing about those in-kind contributions and how not very much is needed at the beginning. Someone's home to meet in, the tea to drink that creates the social opportunity for people to start talking about the plans that they then lay, which then turns into networks and actions that, are the bread and butter of the movement. So yeah, very interesting.
And just on that, right, this is movements win primarily because of what they do within their countries, not because of the support they get from outside. And if we zoom out from that, like if our hope as outside supporters is to build power and strengthen the agency and legitimacy of people,
right,
historically excluded people, to gain rights, to participate in elections, to participate in civil society, to be sort of inclusive and sort of human rights supporting, then we want to be fostering and building lasting ties, not just at the pre-mobilization phase, not just during peak mobilization, not just like after a movement sort of wins or if there's a stalemate and protracted conflict, but build to support the relationships and the skills and the networks that will carry over into society years and decades into the future.
Very good. Very important. So one question we have, I'd like to ask you about an implication of your work, which seems to be NGOization, or the professionalization of civil society siloed into formal NGOs, which, as you say, distracts activists from having to do grassroots work. What would you say to that?
Sure. I mean, I think what I argued or what my research showed was that there is a tendency of donors to sort of encourage informal groups, grassroots, to become more like formal civil society organizations. So yes, there's a tendency to NGOize the informal groups. And that's problematic because many of these groups gain their power from being in the streets, from being outside of the formal institutions. That's where they get legitimacy. What political parties are seen as corrupt or dysfunctional in given society, then people engaging in civic action in politics outside of those parties gives them some credibility. There is a new space that may not be caught up in the corruption or the old families that control the political parties. So when you then try to encourage those informal groups to become registered parties or to become formal NGOs, it often undermines the credibility or the power that they have. and particularly in an era of closing civic space, we see in the many countries around the world that have some form of democracy that many of these formal civil society groups are getting shut down, they're getting deregistered, they're getting all sorts of constraints added to them. And so again, by sort of pushing people for the sake of them receiving our money to become more formal, ironically, in many contexts, it then makes them more vulnerable to then being shut down and monitored and such.
Right. You might be removing that element, which is one of their sources of strength. Right.
And it keeps them safe. But they don't have an office. They haven't given their email addresses and their phone numbers to a government agency to register. And so this is not to demonize NGOs. They're formal civil society groups that do wonderful work, human rights documentation and advocacy and research and reporting and trainings and such. It's just to say when there are people who are engaged in the informal and the grassroots activities that was their choice for all sorts of reasons. And it's their country, they're the experts in their country. So any outsiders who want to support that, we should be respecting their choices and supporting them on their terms.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So a question then relating to things from the experience of recipients. One attendee asks, is there a lobbying mechanism for organizers to reach donors? Is there a way for donors to hear our needs so they can understand the importance of funding grassroots movements? Especially in Africa, I see very little effort from donors to hear from us or our voices being ignored.
This is a thank you for this question. I think I just would highlight, right, that there are many different kinds of donors. There are many diaspora groups come together to provide support. There's a great book by Dana Moss that just came out about diaspora support in the Arab Spring. There are public charities that raise money from all sorts of many sources, and then they sort of re-grant, they give support. They're private foundations that get funding from a couple individuals or from an endowment, and they make funding decisions. There are governments that give support. There are multilateral organizations through the United Nations or the EU. So there are many different kinds of donors. And for activists, it's important to understand some of the differences in decision making and sort of the constraints that these different donors face. So I would encourage any organizer who's thinking about engaging with outside supporters to look at the Dollars in Dissent report and to sort of think through, well, we've been approached by this donor to support us. What kind of donor is it? This report says there's public charities, private foundations that operate a bit differently. And so there's some, if activists want outside support, there's some reason to think about learning a bit more about who these donors are and why they're looking to support you in their internal structures. There are two sort of bodies that I know of that bring together donors, organizers, academics, formal civil society to build trust and get to know each other. One is the Civicus Grassroots Solidarity Revolution, and the other is the Alliance for Feminist Social Movements. Those are two spaces where donors can get to know activists and activists can get to know specific donors and generally donors. But I would just conclude answering this question by saying that, you know, it's getting outside support is not a silver bullet. The movements need resources, but it's often more effective to try to generate the resources, financial and otherwise, from within your communities, from within diaspora groups, from businesses or religious institutions or labor unions that are in your society, rather than, so again, you're building power and coalitions within your society rather than, you know, looking 4, 5, 10,000 miles away to someone else to support you.
Great, thank you. Our last two questions are sort of two different sides of the same coin, and they're looking at the impacts of giving both negative and positive. So I'm going to ask them back to back, and you can answer them as you see fit. So one attendee writes, my question is about internal conflict, which donor support may agitate inside the movements due to the internal competition between different groups inside a movement. Are there any solutions or approaches to lower the chances of donor support causing divisions? And then on the other side, do you believe that funders should use their power to incentivize collaboration and coalition building among grassroots groups?
These are both great questions. On the first one, there's another ICNC report within the last couple of years, the role of external support to nonviolent campaigns, Poison, Chalice, or Holy Grail, that looks at the effects of different types of support on movement success or failure. So in thinking about should donors support or incentivize collaboration or coalition building or that sort of thing, I'd really encourage you to look at this report. And I believe USIP has also has a publication coming out maybe later this year these reports do a deep dive into sort of what types of support are helpful, what ones are harmful, in which contexts, in which phases of a movement. I think it's generally the case that donors can say, we're transparent, we're able to provide certain resources. And if organizers say we really want to learn from folks in a neighboring country, then they can sort of ask for that sort of support. But I think it's providing educational materials and it can be very useful. But when a donor tries to sort of manipulate or to control or to even in a sort of kind incentivization way, it starts to insert some sort of bias of the outsider into how a homegrown movement undertakes their activities or the goals they seek. So it's really it's a little glitch technologically, but it's really for donors to engage with movements out of a positionality of solidarity rather than thinking we know best. Now to the first question about sort of internal conflict and how do we avoid sowing divisions, I give one example and then a sort of an idea. The ideas around donor coordination, donors talking to each other and saying, well, we're inclined to support this group, you're inclined to support that group, let's not double up, let's not create competition, but let's actually provide some more support to two groups, so we're not picking winners and losers, right? And the American Jewish World Service sort of dealt with this challenge, and there's sort of an example of this written up in the Dollars and Dissent report, where they actually, with respect to support in Nicaragua, where they actually paused their grant making and said, we're gonna wait and provide a sort of, and we are going to support a space where organizers can come together and build their own coalitions, can do what they need to together. But we're not going to give any support to any of them yet. We're going to watch, we're going to listen, we're going to observe, we're going to let them work out their differences or their strategies or their goals. And then we're going to support a number of groups in a similar way. So again, not to avoid picking winners and losers. It's really hard to do in some contexts because they're very real decisions donors have to make. But this is where sort of deferring to movement leaders and organizers and really being cautious about not picking winners and losers from outside is really important.
A really important point that I think comes through clearly in your special report as well. The need to respect the goals, the autonomy, the approaches, the insights and expertise and experiences and invested value of and outcomes from the people who are actually on the ground. and not just sort of commandeering what might be seen as the best option from the outside. Thank you for taking the extra time, Ben, to engage with these questions. I really appreciate it. And to our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for joining us again. You can access Ben's report as a free download from ICNC's website. That is nonviolent-conflict.org. You can find it in our resource library. And the name of his report is Dollars and Dissent. Thank you, Ben. We appreciate your time. You have a good night.
Thanks, you too.